account of the Muskogee Nation, etc. Their country is situated nearly in the center, between the Cherokee, Georgia, East and West Florida, and the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, the one 200 and the other 300 miles up the Mississippi. It extends 180 computed miles from north to south. It is called the Creek Country on account of the great number of creeks, or small bays, rivulets, and swamps it abounds with. This nation is generally computed to consist of about 3,500 men fit to bear arms, and has 50 towns, or villages. The principal are Okewasku, Okechai, Tukubatche, Taulaisi, Kauhita, and Chaha. The nation consists of a mixture of several broken tribes, whom the Muskogee artfully decoyed to incorporate with them in order to strengthen themselves against hostile attempts. Their former national names were Tamita, Tekioge, Okechai, Pakana, Wetamka. With them is also one town of the Shawano, and one of the Nachi Indians, likewise two great towns of the Kuasatii. The upper part of the Muskogee country is very hilly, the middle less so, the lower towns, level. These are settled by the remains of the Osika, Oconee, and Sawakula nations. Most of their towns are very commodiously and pleasantly situated on large, beautiful creeks or rivers where the lands are fertile, the water clear and well tasted, and the air extremely pure. As the streams have a quick descent, the climate is of a most happy temperature, free from disagreeable heat or cold, unless for the space of a few days, in summer and winter, according to all our American climes. In their country are 4 bold rivers, which spring from the Apalache Mountains and interlock with the eastern branches of the Mississippi. The Coosa River is the western boundary of their towns. It is 200 yards broad and runs by the Lake Alabama to Mobile, eastward. Aquest lies 70 miles from the former, which, taking a considerable southern sweep, runs a western course, and joins the aforesaid great stream, a little below the deserted garrison. Since the year 1764, the Muskogee have settled several towns, 70 miles eastward from Aquesk, on the Chattahoochee River, near to the old trading path. This great limpid stream is 200 yards broad, and lower down, it passes by the Apalache into Florida, so that this nation extends 140 miles in breadth from east to west, according to the course of the trading path. Their land is generally hilly, but not mountainous, which allows an army an easy passage into their country to retaliate their insults and cruelties. That period seems to advance apace, for the fine flourishing accounts of those who gain by the art will not always quiet a suffering people. As the Muskogee judge only from what they see around them, they firmly believe they are now more powerful than any nation that might be tempted to invade them. Our passive conduct toward them causes them to entertain a very mean opinion of our martial abilities, but before we tamely allowed them to commit acts of hostility, at pleasure, which will soon be mentioned, the traders taught them sometimes by strong felt lessons to conclude the English to be men and warriors. They are certainly the most powerful Indian nation we are acquainted with on this continent, and within 30 years past, they are grown very warlike. Toward the conclusion of their last war with the Cherokee, they defeated them so easily that in contempt they sent several of their women and small boys against them, though, at that time, the Cherokee were the most numerous. The Choctaw were also much inferior to them in several engagements they had with them, though, perhaps, they are the most artful ambuscaders and wolfish savages in America. But, having no rivers in their own country, very few of them can swim, which often proves inconvenient and dangerous when they are in pursuit of the enemy or pursued by them. We should be politically sorry for their differences with each other to be reconciled, as long experience convinces us they cannot live without shedding human blood somewhere or other, on account of their jealous and fierce tempers, and resentment of any kind of injury, and the martial preferment each obtains for every scalp of an enemy. They are so extremely anxious to be distinguished by high war titles that sometimes a small party of warriors, on failing of success in their campaign, have been detected in murdering some of their own people for the sake of their scalps. We cannot expect that they will observe better faith towards us, therefore common sense and self-love ought to direct us to choose the least of two unavoidable evils, ever to keep the wolf from our own doors, by engaging him with his wolfish neighbors. At least, the officious hand of folly should not part them when they are earnestly engaged in their favorite element against each other. All the other Indian nations we have any acquaintance with are visibly and fast declining on account of their continual merciless wars, the immoderate use of spirituous liquors, and the infectious ravaging nature of the smallpox. But the Muskogee have few enemies, and the traders with them have taught them to prevent the last contagion from spreading among their towns by cutting off all communication with those who are infected, till the danger is over. Besides, as the men rarely go to war till they have helped the women to plant a sufficient plenty of provisions, contrary to the usual method of warring savages, it is so great a help to propagation, that by this means also, and their artful policy of inviting decayed tribes to incorporate with them, I am assured by a gentleman of distinguished character, who speaks their language as well as their best orators, they have increased double in number within the space of 30 years past. Notwithstanding their widows are confined to a strict state of celibacy for the full space of 4 years after the death of their husbands. When we consider that 2 or 3 will go several hundred miles to waylay an enemy, the contiguous situation of such a prodigious number of corrupt, haughty, and mischievous savages to our valuable colonies ought to draw our attention upon them. Those of us who have gained a sufficient knowledge of Indian affairs by long experience and observation are firmly persuaded that the seeds of war are deeply implanted in their hearts against us, and that the allowing them, in our usual tame manner, to insult, plunder, and murder peaceable British subjects only tempts them to engage deeper in their diabolical scenes of blood, till they commence a dangerous open war against us. The only probable means to preserve peace is either to set them and their rivals on one another, or by prudent management, influence them to employ themselves in raising silk, or any other staple commodity that would best suit their own temper and climate. Prudence points out this, but the task is too arduous for strangers ever to be able to effect, or they care not about it. Before the late cession of East and West Florida to Great Britain, the country of the Muskogee lay between the territories of the English, Spaniards, French, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee. And as they had a water carriage from the 2 Floridas to secure their liberties, and a great trade by land from Georgia and South Carolina, this nation regulated the Indian balance of power in our southern parts of North America, for the French could have thrown the mercenary Choctaw and the Mississippi savages into the scale whenever their interest seemed to require it. The Muskogee, having 3 rival Christian powers their near neighbors, and a French garrison on the southern extremity of the central part of their country ever since the War of the year 1715, the old men, being long informed by the opposite parties of the different views and intrigues of those European powers who paid them annual tribute under the vague appellation of presents, were become surprisingly crafty in every turn of low politics. They held it as an invariable maxim that their security and welfare required a perpetual friendly intercourse with us and the French, as our political state of war with each other would always secure their liberties, whereas, if they joined either party and enabled it to prevail over the other, their state, they said, would then become as unhappy as that of a poor fellow who had only one perverse wife, and yet must bear with her froward temper, but a variety of choice would have kept off such an afflicting evil, either by his giving her a silent caution against behaving ill, or by enabling him to go to another, who was in a better temper. But as the French Alabama garrison had been long directed by skillful officers, and supplied pretty well with corrupting brandy, taffy, and decoying trifles at the expense of government, they industriously applied their mischievous talents in impressing many of the former simple and peaceable natives with false notions of the ill intentions of our colonies. In each of their towns, the French gave a considerable pension to an eloquent headman to corrupt the Indians by plausible pretexts and inflame them against us, who informed them also of every material occurrence in each of their respective circles. The force of liquors made them so faithful to their trust that they poisoned the innocence of their own growing families by tempting them, from their infancy, to receive the worst impressions of the British colonists, and as they very seldom got the better of those prejudices, they alienated the affections of their offspring and riveted their bitter enmity against us. That conduct of the Christian French has fixed many of the Muskogee in a strong native hatred to the British Americans, which being hereditary, must of course increase, as fast as they increase in numbers, unless we give them such a severe lesson, as their annual hostile conduct to us has highly deserved, since their worst actions make a distinction between the morally virtuous and vicious. The other white people of that trading house happily were at that time in the woods. They heard the savage platoon, and the death and war whoop, which sufficiently warned them of their imminent danger, and to seek their safety by the best means they could. Some of them went through the woods after night, to our friend Towns, and one who happened to be near the town when the alarm was given, going to bring in a horse, was obliged to hide himself under a large fallen tree, till night came on. The eager savages came twice, pretty near him, imagining he would choose rather to depend on the horse's speed than his own. When the town was engaged in dividing the spoils, his wife, fearing she might be watched, took a considerable sweep round through the thickets, and by searching the place and making signals where she expected he lay concealed, fortunately found him and gave him provisions to enable him to get to our settlements, and then returned home in tears. He arrived safe at Augusta, though exceedingly torn with the brambles, as his safety required him to travel through unfrequented tracks. In the meanwhile, the savages, having by this inflamed their greedy thirst for blood, set off swiftly, and as they darted along sounding the news of war, they from a few increased so fast that their voices conveyed such thrilling shocks to those they were in quest of, as if the infernal legions had broken loose through their favorite Alabama, and were invested with power to destroy the innocent. The great Oquas town, where they reached, lay on the western side of the large easternmost branch of Mobile River, which joins a far greater western river, almost 2 miles below the late Alabama, and the English traders' storehouses lay opposite to the town. Those red ambassadors of the French artfully passed the river above the town, and ran along silently to a gentleman's dwelling house, where they first shot down one of his servants, and in a minute or two after, himself. Probably he might have been saved if he had not been too desperate, for a strong-bodied leading warrior of the town was at his house when they came to it, who grasped him behind, with his face toward the wall, on purpose to save him from being shot, as they durst not kill himself under the certain pain of death. But very unluckily, the gentleman struggled, got hold of him, threw him to the ground, and so became too fair a mark. Thus the Frenchified savages cut off, in the bloom of his youth, the son of J. R. Esq., Indian trading merchant of Augusta, who was the most stately, comely, and gallant youth that ever traded in the Muskogee country, and equally blessed with every social virtue that attracts esteem. The very savages lament his death to this day, though it was usual with him to correct as many of the swaggering heroes as could stand round him in his house, when they became impudent and mischievous, through the plea of drinking spirituous liquors. When they recover from their bacchanal frenzy, they regard a man of a martial spirit, and contemn the pusillanimous. While the town was in the utmost surprise, the ambitious warriors were joyfully echoing, "All is spoiled," and sounding the death whoop. They, like so many infernal furies commissioned to destroy, set off at full speed, dispersing their bloody legions to various towns, to carry general destruction along with them. But before any of their companies reached to the Okai war town, the native place of the great mortar, the inhabitants had heard the massacre was begun, and according to their rule, killed 2 of our traders in their house, when quite off their guard, as these traders were brave, and regardless of danger by their habit of living, the savages were afraid to bring their arms with them, it being unusual, by reason of the secure situation of the town. A few, therefore, entered the house, with a specious pretense, and intercepted them from the firearms, which lay on a rack, on the front of the chimney. They instantly seized them, and as they were loaded with large shot, they killed those 2 valuable and intrepid men, and left them on the fire. But if they had been a few minutes forewarned of the danger, their lives would have cost the whole town very dear, unless they had kindled the house with fire arrows. Like pestilential vapors driven by whirlwinds, the mischievous savages endeavored to bring desolation on the innocent objects of their fury, wherever they came, but the different flights of the trading people, as well as their own expertness in the woods, and their connections with the Indians, both by marriage and other ties of friendship, disappointed the accomplishment of the main point of the French diabolical scheme of dipping them all over in blood. By sundry means, a considerable number of our people met at the friendly house of the old Wolf King, 2 miles from the Alabama fort, where that faithful stern chieftain treated them with the greatest kindness. But, as the whole nation was distracted, and the neighboring towns were devoted to the French interest, he found that by having no fortress, and only 40 warriors in his town, he was unable to protect the refugees. In order therefore to keep good faith with his friends, who put themselves under his protection, he told them their situation, supplied those of them with arms and ammunition who chanced to have none, and conveyed them into a contiguous thick swamp as their only place of security for that time, which their own valor, he said, he was sure would maintain, both against the French and their mad friends. He was not mistaken in his favorable opinion of their war abilities, for they ranged themselves so well that the enemy found it impracticable to attack them without sustaining far greater loss than they are known to hazard. He supplied them with necessaries and sent them safe at length to a friendly town at a considerable distance, where they joined several other traders from different places and were soon after safely escorted to Savannah. It is surprising how those hardy men evaded the dangers they were surrounded with, especially at the beginning, and with so little loss. One of them told me that while a party of the savages were on a cornhouse scaffold, painting themselves red and black, to give the cowardly blow to him and his companion, an old woman overheard them concerting their bloody design, and speedily informed him of the threatening danger. He mentioned the intended place of meeting to his friends, and they immediately set off, one this way, and another that, to prevent a pursuit, and all met safe, to the great regret of the Christian French and their red hirelings. I was informed that another considerable trader, who lived near a river on the outside of a town, where he stood secure in the affection of his savage brethren, received a visit from 2 lusty ill-looking strangers, without being discovered by any of the inhabitants. They were anointed with bear's oil, and quite naked, except a narrow slip of cloth for breeches, and a light blanket. When they came in, they looked around, wild and confused, not knowing how to execute the French commission, consistently with their own safety, as they brought no arms, lest it should have discovered their intentions, and by that means exposed them to danger. But they seated themselves near the door, both to prevent his escape, and watch a favorable opportunity to perpetrate their murdering scheme. His white domestics were a little before gone into the woods, and he and his Indian wife were in the storehouse, where there chanced to be no arms of defense, which made his escape the more hazardous. He was nearly in the same light dress as that of his visitants, according to the mode of their domestic living. He was about to give them some tobacco, when their countenances, growing more gloomy and fierce, were observed by his wife, as well as the mischievous direction of their eyes. Presently, therefore, as they bounded up, the one to lay hold of the white man, and the other of an axe that lay on the floor, she seized it at the same instant, and cried, "Husband, fight strong, and run off, as becomes a good warrior." The savage strove to lay hold of him, till the other could disengage himself from the sharp struggle the woman held with him, but by a quick presence of mind, the husband decoyed his pursuer round a large ladder that joined the loft, and being strong and swift-footed, he there took the advantage of his too eager adversary, dashed him to the ground, and ran out of the house, full speed to the river, bounded into it, soon made the opposite shore, and left them at the storehouse, from whence the woman, as a trusty friend, drove them off, with the utmost despite. Her family was her protection. The remaining part of that day, he ran a great distance through the woods, called at night on such white people as he imagined his safety allowed him, was joined by 4 of them, and went together to Pensacola. Within 3 or 4 days' march of that place, the lands, they told me, were in general either boggy and low, or consisting of sandy pine barrens. Although they were almost naked, and had lived for many days on the produce of the woods, yet the dastardly Spaniards were so hardened against the tender feelings of nature in favor of the distressed, who now took sanctuary under the Spanish flag, as to refuse them every kind of assistance, contrary to the hospitable custom of the red savages, even towards those they devote to the fire. A north country skipper, who rode in the harbor, was equally divested of the bowels of compassion toward them, notwithstanding their pressing entreaties and offers of bills on very respectable persons in Charlestown. But the commandant of the place soon instructed him very feelingly in the common laws of humanity, for on some pretext he seized the vessel and cargo, and left the narrow-hearted miser to shift for himself, and return home as he could. Those unfortunate traders were kindly treated, however, by the headman of an adjacent town of the Apalach Indians, who, being a considerable dealer, supplied them with everything they stood in need of, till, in time, they were recalled, for which they questions, cant language, and discomposed countenances, informed him of their bloody intentions, and cautioned him from falling into any of their wily stratagems, which all cowards are dexterous in forming. When they came to a boggy cane branch, they strove to persuade him to alight and rest a little, but finding their labor in vain, they got down. One prepared a club to kill him, and the other a small frame of split canes tied together with bark, to bear his scalp. Seeing this, he set off with a bravado whoop through the high lands, and as he rode a swift horse, he left them out of sight in an instant. He took a great sweep round, to avoid an afterchase. At night, he went to the town, got firearms and provisions, and soon arrived safe in Georgia. Other instances may be related, but these will suffice to show how serviceable such hardy and expert men would be to their country, as heretofore, if our Indian trade was properly regulated, and how exceedingly preferable the 10th part of their number would prove against boasted regular troops in the woods. Though the British legions are as warlike and formidable in the field of battle as any troops whatever, as their martial bravery has often testified, yet in some situations they would be insignificant and helpless. Regular bred soldiers in the American woods would be of little service. The natives and old inhabitants, by being trained to arms from their infancy in their woodland sphere of life, could always surround them and sweep them off entirely with little damage to themselves. In such a case, field pieces are a mere farce. The abettors of arbitrary power, who are making great advances through the whole British Empire, to force the people to decide this point and retrieve their constitutional rights and liberties, would do well to consider this. Is it possible for tyranny to be so weak and blind as to flatter its corrupt greatness with the wild notion of placing a despotic military power of a few thousand regular troops over millions of the Americans who are trained to arms of defense from the time they are able to carry them, generally inured to dangers, and all of them possessing, in a high degree, the social virtues of their manly free-minded forefathers, who often bled in the noble cause of liberty when hateful? Tyranny persisted in stretching her rod of oppression over their repining country? Tyrants are obstinately deaf and blind. They will see and hear only through the false medium of self-interested court flatterers, and, instead of redressing the grievances of the people, have sometimes openly despised and insulted them for even exhibiting their modest prayers at the foot of the throne for a restoration of their rights and privileges. Some, however, have been convinced in the end they were wrong, and have justly suffered by the anathematizing voice of God and a federal union. That a prince can do no ill is a flat contradiction of reason and experience, and of the English Magna Carta. Soon after West Florida was ceded to Great Britain, 2 warlike towns of the Coasatee Indians were moved from near the late dangerous Alabama French garrison to the Choctaw country about 25 miles below Tombigbee, a strong wooden fortress situated on the western side of a high and firm bank overlooking a narrow deep point of the River of Mobile, and distant from that capital 100 leagues. The discerning old war chieftain of this remnant perceived that the proud Muskogee, instead of reforming their conduct towards us by our mild remonstrances, grew only more impudent by our lenity. Therefore, being afraid of sharing the justly deserved fate of the others, he wisely withdrew to this situation, as the French could not possibly supply them, in case we had exerted ourselves either in defense of our properties, or in revenge of the blood they had shed. But they were soon forced to return to their former place of abode, on account of the partiality of some of them to their former confederates, which proved lucky in its consequences to the traders and our southern colonies, for, when 300 warriors of the Muskogee were on their way to the Choctaw to join them in a war against us, 2 Coasat horsemen, as allies, were allowed to pass through their ambuscade in the evening, and they gave notice of the impending danger. These Coasat Indians annually sanctify the mulberries by a public oblation, before which they are not to be eaten, which they say is according to their ancient law. I am assured by a gentleman of character, who traded a long time near the late Alabama garrison, that within 6 miles of it lived the remains of 7 Indian nations, who usually conversed with each other in their own different dialects, though they understood the Muskogee language, but being naturalized, they were bound to observe the laws and customs of the main original body. These reduced, broken tribes, who have helped to multiply the Muskogee to a dangerous degree, have also a fixed oral tradition that they formerly came from South America, and, after sundry struggles in defense of liberty, settled their present abode, but the Muskogee record themselves to be terrae filii, and believe their original predecessors came from the west, and resided underground, which seems to be a faint image of the original formation of mankind out of the earth, perverted by time and the usual arts of priestcraft. It will be fortunate if the late peace between the Muskogee and Choctaw, through the mediation of a superintendent, doth not soon affect the security of Georgia and East and West Florida, especially should it continue long, and Britain and Spain engage in a war against each other, for Spain will supply them with warlike stores, and in concert may without much opposition retake the Floridas, which they seem to have much at heart. A Cuba vessel, in the year 1767, which seemed to be coasting on purpose to meet some of the Muskogee, found a camp of them almost opposite to the Appalach old fields, and proposed purchasing those lands from them, in order to secure their liberties, and, the same time, gratify the inherent, ardent desire they always had to oppose the English nation. After many artful flourishes, well adapted to soothe the natives into a compliance on account of the reciprocal advantages they proposed, some of the Muskogee consented to go in the vessel to the Havana, and there finished the friendly bargain. They went, and at the time proposed, were sent back to the same place, but, as they are very close in their secrets, the traders know not the result of that affair, but when things in Europe require, time will disclose it. As the Muskogee were well known to be very mischievous to our barrier inhabitants, and to be an overmatch for the numerous and fickle Choctaw, the few warlike Chickasaw, by being put in the scale with these, would in a few years have made the Muskogee kick the beam. Thus our southern colonists might have sat in pleasure and security under their fig trees and in their charming arbors of fruitful grapevines. But now they are uncertain whether they plant for themselves or for the red savages, who frequently take away by force or stealth their horses and other effects. The Muskogee chieftain, called the Great Mortar, abetted the Cherokee against us, as hath been already noticed, and frequently, with his warriors and relations, carried them as good a supply of ammunition as the French of the Alabama garrison could well spare, for by order of their government they were bound to reserve a certain quantity for any unforeseen occasion that might happen. If they had been possessed of more, they would have given with a liberal hand to enable them to carry on a war against us, and they almost effected their earnest wishes, when the English little expected it, for as soon as the watchful officer of the garrison was informed by his trusty and well-instructed red disciple, the Great Mortar, that the Cherokee were on the point of declaring against the English, he saw the consequence, and sent a packet by a Muskogee runner to Tombigbee fort in the Choctaw country, which was forwarded by another, and soon delivered to the governor of New Orleans. The contents informed him of the favorable opportunity that offered for the French to settle themselves in the Cherokee country, where the late Fort Loudon stood, near the conflux of Great Tellico and Tenace rivers, and so distress our southern colonies, as the body of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Choctaw, Aquapa, and the upper Mississippi Indians headed by the French would be able to maintain a certain successful war against us, if well supplied with ammunition. Their deliberations were short. They soon sent off a large pettiauger, sufficiently laden with warlike stores and decoying presents, and in obedience to the orders the crew had received of making all the dispatch they possibly could, in the 3rd moon of their departure from New Orleans, they arrived within 120 computed miles of those towns that are a little above the unhappy Fort Loudon. There they were luckily stopped in their mischievous career by a deep and dangerous cataract, the waters of which rolled down with a prodigious rapidity, dashed against the opposite rocks, and from thence rushed off with impetuous violence on a quarter-angled course. It appeared so shocking and unsurmountable to the messieurs that after staying there a considerable time, in the vain expectation of seeing some of their friends, necessity forced them to return back to New Orleans, about 2,600 computed miles, to their inconsolable disappointment. These circumstances are now well known to our colonies, and, if our state policy had not sufficiently discovered itself of late, it would appear not a little surprising that the great mortar should have such influence on the great beloved man, so the Indians termed the superintendent, as to move him, at a congress in Augusta, to write by that bitter enemy of the English name a conciliating letter to the almost vanquished and desponding Choctaw, for where the conquerors have not an oblique point in view, the conquered are always the first who humbly sue for peace. Modest reply to His Excellency J. G. Esq., printed in Charlestown, in the year 1750, in which every material circumstance is sufficiently authenticated. When we consider the defenseless state and near situation of our 3 southern barrier colonies to the numerous Muskogee and Choctaw, what favorable opinion can charity reasonably induce us to form of the continued train of wrong measures the managers of our Indian affairs have studiously pursued, by officiously mediating and reconciling the deep-rooted enmity which subsisted between those 2 mischievous nations? If they could not, consistent with the tenor of their political office, encourage a continuance of the war, they might have given private instructions to some discreet traitor to strive to influence them, so as to continue it. It is excusable in clergymen that live in England to persuade us to inculcate and endeavor to promote peace and goodwill between the savages of the remote desarts of America, especially if they employ their time in spiritual affairs, to which they ought to be entirely devoted, and not as courtiers in the perplexing labyrinths of state affairs. But what can be said of those statesmen who, instead of faithfully guarding the lives and privileges of valuable subjects, extend mercy to their murderers, who have a long time wantonly shed innocent blood, and sometimes with dreadful tortures? The blood cries aloud to the avenging God, to cause justice to be executed on their execrable heads. For a while they may escape due punishment, but at last it will fall heavy upon them. When the superintendent's deputy convened most of the Muskogee headmen in order to write a friendly mediating letter to the Chickasaw in behalf of the Muskogee, the great mortar, animated with a bitter resentment against anything transacted by any of the British nation, introduced a considerable number of his relations, merely to disconcert this plan. The letter and usual Indian tokens of peace and friendship were however carried up by a Chickasaw trader, but the great mortar timed it so well that he soon set off after the other with 90 warriors, till he arrived within 150 miles of the Chickasaw country, which was halfway from the western barriers of his own. There he encamped with 83, and sent off 7 of the staunchest to surprise and kill whomsoever they could. 2 days after the express was delivered, they treacherously killed 2 young women as they were hoeing in the field, all the people being off their guard on account of the late friendly tokens they received, and the assurance of the white man that there were no visible tracks of any person on the long trading path he had come. This was the beginning of May, in the year 1768, a few hours after I had set off for South Carolina. As soon as the skulking barbarians had discharged the contents of their guns into their innocent victims, they tomahawked them, and with their long sharp knives, took off the scalps, put up the death whoop-whoop, and bounded away in an oblique course to shun the dreaded pursuit. The Chickasaws soon put up their shrill war-whoop to arm and pursue, and 60 set off on horseback, full speed. They overshot that part of the woods the enemy were most likely to have fled through, and 4 young sprightly Chickasaw warriors who outran the rest, at last discovered and intercepted them. They shot dead the great mortar's brother, who was the leader, scalped him, and retook one of the young women's scalps that was fastened to his girdle. 3 continued the chase, and the 4th in a short time overtook them. Soon afterward, they came up again with the enemy, at the edge of a large cane swamp, thick warped with vines and china briars. There they stopped, and were at first in doubt of there being some of their own company. The pursued soon discovered them, and immediately enswamped, whereupon the 4 were forced to decline the attack, the disadvantage being as 4 to 8 in an open engagement. In a few days after, I fell in with them. Their gloomy and fierce countenances cannot be expressed, and I had the uncourted honor of their company 3 different times before I could reach my destined place, on account of a very uncommon and sudden flow of the rivers, without any rain. Between sunset and 11 o'clock the next day, the river, that was but barely our height in the evening, was swelled to the prodigious height of 25 feet perpendicular, and swept along with an impetuous force. It may not be improper here to mention the method we commonly use in crossing deep rivers. When we expect high rivers, each company of traders carry a canoe, made of tanned leather, the sides overlapped about 3 fingers breadth, and well sewed with 3 seams. Around the gunwales, which are made of saplings, are strong loopholes for large deerskin strings to hang down both the sides. With 2 of these is securely tied to the stem and stern, a well-shaped sapling for a keel, and in like manner the ribs. Thus, they usually rig out a canoe, fit to carry over 10 horse loads at once. In the space of half an hour, the apparatus is afterwards commonly hidden with great care on the opposite shore. Few take the trouble to paddle the canoe, for, as they are commonly hardy, and also of an amphibious nature, they usually jump into the river, with their leathern barge ahead of them, and thrust it through the deep part of the water, to the opposite shore. When we ride only with a few luggage horses, as was our case at Sip-SC, or Poplar, the above-mentioned high-swelled river, we make a frame of dry pines, which we tie together with strong vines, well twisted. When we have raised it to be sufficiently buoyant, we load and paddle it across the stillest part of the water we can conveniently find, and afterward swim our horses together, we keeping at a little distance below them. At the time we first began to search for convenient floating timber, I chanced to stand at the end of a dry tree, overset by a hurricane, within 3 feet of a great rattlesnake that was coiled, and on his watch of self-defense, under thick herbage. I soon espied, and killed him. But an astrologer, of 20 years standing among the Indians, immediately declared with strong asseverations we should soon be exposed to imminent danger, which he expatiated upon largely, from his imagined knowledge of a combination of second causes in the celestial regions, actuating every kind of animals, vegetables, etc., by their subtle and delegated power. I argued in vain to hush his groundless fears. However, while the raft was getting ready, another gentleman, to quiet his timorous apprehensions, accompanied me with firearms, pretty near the path in the before-mentioned cane swamp, and we stayed there a considerable while, at a proper distance apart. At last we heard the well-mimicked voice of partridges, farther off than our sight could discover, on which one of us struck up the whoop of friendship and indifference, for I knew that the best way of arguing on such occasions was by a firmness of countenance and behavior. I then went near to my companion, and said, our cunning man was an Aberdeen wizard, as he had so exactly foretold the event. The savages had both discovered our tracks, and heard the sound of the axe. We soon met them. They were 9 of the mischievous Ochai town, who had separated from the rest of their company. We conversed a little while together upon our arms, and in this manner exchanged provisions with each other. Then we went down to the bank of the river, where they opened their packs, spread out some hairy deer and bear skins with the fleshy side undermost, and having first placed on them their heavy things, and then the lighter, with the guns which lay uppermost, each made 2 knots with the shanks of a skin, and in the space of a few minutes, they had their leathern barge afloat, which they soon thrust before them to the other shore, with a surprisingly small deviation from a direct course, considering the strong current of the water. When our astrologer saw them safe off, he wished them a speedy journey home, without being exposed to the necessity of any delay. He was soon after carried safe over on our raft, though once he almost overset it, either by reason of the absence or disturbance of his mind. Had he contracted a fever, from the impending dangers his knowledge assured him were not yet past, the cold sweat he got when left by himself, while we were returning with the raft, and afterward swimming with the horses, must have contributed a good deal to the cure. Soon afterwards, we came in sight of their camp in a little spot of clear land, surrounded by a thick cane swamp, where some traders formerly had been killed by the Choctaw. Our astrologer urged the necessity of proceeding a good way farther, to avoid the danger. I endeavored to convince him by several recent instances that a timorous conduct was a great incentive to the base-minded savages to do an injury, not expecting any defense, while an open, free, and resolute behavior, a show of taking pleasure in their company, and a discreet care of our firearms seldom failed to gain the goodwill of such as are not engaged in actual war against our country. He acquiesced, as I engaged to sit next to the Indian camp, which was about a dozen yards apart from ours. He chose his place pretty near to mine, but in the evening I told him that as I did not understand the Muskogee dialect, nor they much of the Chickasaw language, I would give him the opportunity of diverting himself at leisure with them, whilst on account of the fatigues of the day, I would repose myself close at the root of a neighboring tree. This method of encamping in different places, on hazardous occasions, is by far the safest way. I told them, before my removal to my night quarters, that he was almost their countryman, by a residence of above 20 years among them. The chieftain therefore readily addressed him, and according to what I expected, gave me an opportunity of decently retiring. But when he expected a formal reply, according to their usual custom, our astrological interpreter spoke only a few troublesome and hurtful to others. He could not imagine I believed anything of a divine providence or a resurrection of the dead, which were evidently alike true, as appeared both by divine writ and the united consent of every ancient nation. He said, people were ordered to watch and pray. I therefore could not be ruled by the scripture, for why did I go to bed so soon, and leave all that trouble to him? I told him, I wished he might by prayer obtain a calm composure of mind. He said, I was the cause of all his uneasiness, by inducing him, contrary to his overnight's bloody dream, to lie so near those wolfish savages. Then, in an angry panic, he cursed me, and said, he should not that night have prayed there, only that the devil tempted him to believe my damned lies, and sin against the divine intimations he had received just before. Within half a day's ride of Augusta, I met the gentlemen who were appointed to meet certain headmen of the Muskogee, to run a line between Georgia and the Muskogee country. The superintendent's deputy before mentioned, accompanying them, I then informed him of the bad situation of the Indian trade, both in the Chickasaw and Muskogee nations, the cause thereof, the dangerous policy of having reconciled those jarring warlike savages, the ill disposition of the latter toward us, and it was the opinion of all the traders, one excepted, that nothing but their hot war with the Choctaw prevented them from executing their mischievous intentions against us. I said this to the commissary before the several gentlemen, but his conduct, and that of his brother officer in the Chickasaw country, were no way corresponded to the advice. While he benefited the ungrateful Muskogee, and gave them a plea to injure the traders, he was free from personal danger, from the red quarter, but one night at camp, after the line had been, at the friendly and artful persuasions of G.G. Esq., run above 20 miles beyond the southern limites agreed upon, he almost fatally experienced the effects of their revengeful temper, which cannot be restrained when they imagine themselves really injured, and afterwards insulted, for as he was chiding a noted warrior with sharp language, the savage leaped up, seized the other's gun, cocked, and presented it against his breast, but luckily he could not discharge it, as it was double-triggered, contrary to the model of their smooth-bore guns. The public prince, however, echoed the success of our directors of Indian affairs on this important occasion, though it was entirely owing to the abilities and faithful application, first, of Mr. G.G., and afterwards of Mr. L.M. G., which the deputy almost prevented by his imprudent conduct, that had nearly cost him also his life, and endangered the public tranquility. In the year 1749, when I was going to Charlestown, under the provincial seal of South Carolina, with a party of the Chickasaw Indians, the smallpox attacked them, not far from the Muskogee country, which becoming general through the camp, I was under the necessity of setting off by myself, between Flint River and that of the Igmulga. I came up with a large camp of Muskogee traders, returning from the English settlements. The gentlemen told me they had been lately assured at Augusta by the Cherokee traders that above 120 of the French Shawano might be daily expected near that place, to cut off the English traders and plunder their camps, and cautioned me, with much earnestness at parting, to keep a watchful eye during that day's march. After having rode 15 miles, about 10 o'clock, I discovered ahead through the trees an Indian ascending a steep hill. He perceived me at the same instant, for they are extremely watchful on such dangerous attempts. Ambuscade is their favorite method of attack. As the company followed their leader in a line, each at the distance of a few yards from the other, all soon appeared in view. As soon as I discovered the foremost, I put up the shrill whoop of friendship, and continually seemed to look earnestly behind me, till we approached near to each other, in order to draw their attention from me, and fix it that way, as supposing me to be the foremost of a company still behind. 5 or 6 soon ran at full speed on each side of the path and blocked up 2 valleys, which happened to be at the place of our meeting, to prevent my escape. They seemed as if their design was to attack me with their barbed arrows, lest they should alarm my supposed companions by the report of their guns. I observed that instead of carrying their bow and quiver over their shoulder, as is the traveling custom, they held the former in their left hand, bent, and some arrows. I approached and addressed them, and endeavored to appear quite indifferent at their hostile arrangement. While I held my gun ready in my right hand about 5 yards distant from them, their leader who stood foremost came and struck my breast with the butt end of one of my pistols, which I had in my left hand. I told him with that vehemence of speech, which is always requisite on such an occasion, that I was an English Chickasaw, and informed him by expressive gestures that there were 2 tens of Chickasaw warriors, and more than half that number of women, besides children, a little behind, just beyond the first hill. At this news, they appeared to be much confused, as it was unexpected for such a number of warlike enemies to be so near at hand. This Shawano party consisted only of 23 middle-sized, but strong-bodied men, with large heads and broad flat crowns, and 4 tall young persons, whom I conjectured to be of the Chirag Nation. I spoke a little to a hair-lipped warrior among them, who told me he lived in Tuckasich, a northern town of that country. The leader whispered something to his waiter, which, in like manner, was communicated to the rest, and then they all passed by me, with sullen looks and glancing eyes. I kept my guard till they were out of arrow shot, when I went on at a seemingly indifferent pace. But, as soon out of their view, I rode about 70 miles with great speed, to avoid the danger of a pursuit, as I imagined they would be highly enraged against me for their double disappointment. About sunset of the same day, I discovered more Indians ahead, but, instead of sounding the usual whoop of defiance, I went on slowly, and silently, a little way, reasoning with myself about the safest method in so dangerous a situation. I had apprehensions of there being another party of the Shawano company, separated in that manner to avoid a pursuit, which otherwise might be very easy, by the plainness of their tracks, through the long grass and herbage. But, at the critical time, when I had concluded to use no chivalry, but give them leg bail instead of it, by leaving my baggage horses, and making for a deep swamp, I discovered them to be a considerable body of the Muskogee headmen, returning home with presents from Charlestown, which they carried chiefly on their backs. The Wolf King, as the traders termed him, our old steady friend of the Amuklasa town, near the late Alabama, came foremost, harnessed like a jackass, with a saddle on his back, well girt over one shoulder, and a cross under the other. We seemed equally glad to meet each other, they, to hear how affairs stood in their country, as well as on the trading path, and I to find that instead of bitter-hearted foes, they were friends, and would secure my retreat from any pursuit that might happen. I told them the whole circumstances attending my meeting the Shawano, with their being conducted by our deceitful Chirag friends, who were desirous of spoiling the old beloved white path by making it red, and earnestly persuaded them to be on their guard that night, as I imagined the enemy had pursued me when they found I had eluded their bloody intention. After a long conversation together, I advised them to go home through the woods, to prevent a larger body of the lurking enemy from spoiling them and their beloved country by the loss of so many old beloved men and noted warriors. I said this to rouse them against the Chirag, well knowing that one pack of wolves was the best watch against another of the same kind. They thanked me for the friendly notice I gave them, and the care I showed for their safety, and engaged me to call the next day at a hunting camp, where was a war leader, the son of the Dog King of the Uphill town, with a considerable number of their people, and desire them to remove with all speed to their camp at the place they then fixed on. We smoked tobacco and parted well pleased. According to promise, I went the next day to the camp, and delivered their message, which was readily complied with. The Shawano whom I had eluded, after rambling about, and by viewing the smoke of fires from the tops of high hills and trees, and carefully listening to the report of guns, fell in with 2 Chickasaw hunters, who were adopted relations of the Muskogee, and killed, and scalped them, and then ran off to the northern towns of the Chirag. This was the true and sole cause of the last war between the Muskogee and Chirag, and the following account of the cause of those nations entering into amity with each other will, on the strictest inquiry, be found as true. The cause and direful effects are still feelingly known to great numbers of the suffering inhabitants, which I insert by way of caution to statesmen hereafter. As the Indians have no public faith to secure the lives of friendly messengers in wartime, their wars are perpetuated from one generation to another, unless they are ended by the mediation of some neutral party. A very polished courtier presided in South Carolina, who was said to have cast a very earnest eye on the supposed profits of the Cherokee trade, which were much lessened by the Muskogee War, and, in order to establish it at its former value, so as to be worth some hazard, he exerted himself to reconcile the Muskogee and Cherokee. If he succeeded, he was sure to be something in pocket, and could report at home the fickle and ungovernable temper of their young men and ambitious leaders, when they had no red enemies to war with, to obtain higher war titles by scalps, and their wisdom saw at a distance the dangerous consequences that must attend a general peace. For a considerable time, therefore, they highly inveighed and firmly guarded against it. But when a man's private interest coincides with what he intends to accomplish, he is assiduous and more intent to effect it. This was verified by the unwearied diligence of the prime magistrate alluded to. He knew the Indians could not kill so many deer and beaver in the time of war as of peace, and by his address, he persuaded several of the leading traders, even contrary to their own outward security and inward choice, to exert their strongest endeavors with the Muskogee for a reconciliation with the Cherokee. The chief of those trading gentlemen who unwillingly involved himself in this pernicious affair was the humane and intelligent L.M.G.L.W.R.E.S.Q. Each had their lessons to set forth the reciprocal advantages of the contending parties by such a coalition, but it was finished by that gentleman's earnest and well-timed application, connected with his great natural sense and easy flow of their own bold figurative way of expression, and their favorable opinion of his steady, honest principles. Since that unlucky period, he has as often lamented his success in that affair as the discerning honest rulers of the Muskogee opposed it. He told me that when he was soliciting some of the headmen to comply with the fraternal proposals of our kindly ruler, he unexpectedly met with a very sharp repulse, for, when he had finished his oration on the disadvantages of frowning war and the advantages of smiling peace, an old war leader retorted every paragraph he had spoken, and told him that till then he always had reckoned the English a very wise people, but now he was sorry to find them unwise in the most material point, adding, "You have made yourself very poor by sweating far and near in our smoky townhouses and hothouses, only to make a peace between us and the Cherokee, and thereby enable our young mad people to give you, in a short time, a far worse sweat than you have yet had, or may now expect. But, forasmuch as the great English chieftain in Charlestown is striving hard to have it so, by ordering you to shut your eyes and stop your ears, lest the power of conviction should reach your heart, we will not any more oppose you in this mad scheme. We shall be silent concerning it, otherwise I should be as mad as you, if I reasoned any more with one who is willfully blind and deaf." A number of their warriors met at Charlestown at the time appointed. Their high-stationed English friend then took a great deal of pains to inform them of the mutual advantages that would accrue to them by a firm peace, and he convinced their senses of it by a visible proof, for he borrowed from one of them an arrow, and holding each end of it in his hands, he readily broke it, which surprised none of the red spectators, except the owner. They did not then regard it as a symbolical performance, but a boyish action. He again requested from the same young warrior the loan of his remaining sheaf of arrows, who reluctantly gave them, as he feared they would all singly fare the fate of the former. But, when he held the bundle by each end in his hands, and could only bend it a little, he revived the watchful owner, and pleasingly surprised the attentive savages, as he thereby had strongly demonstrated to them that vis you need a fortier, upon which he expatiated, in easy fine language, to the great joy of his red audience. By such evidence, they were induced to shake hands firmly together, and likewise to endeavor to preserve a perpetual union with all their neighboring nations, lest the wolf should attack them separately. And ever since that impolitic mediation, they have been so strongly convinced of their great advantage and security by a close friendly union with each other that all the efforts of the wise and honest Georgia patriot, Governor Ellis, in concert with the Indian trading merchants, to dissolve it in the year 1760, proved abortive with the wary and jealous Muskogee, while we were at war with the Cherokee. And many of the outsettlers of Georgia and South Carolina were plundered and murdered by them, without sparing women or children, many instances of which we were too often well acquainted with on the spot. The Cherokee, however, stood in such great awe of about 60 Chickasaw warriors that except once when they were repulsed by a treble inferior number, they durst not attempt any sort of attack on Georgia barriers during the whole continuance of the war. The wisdom of the ruling members of that weak colony directed them, in their dangerous circumstances, to choose the least of two evils, to humor and bear with those mischievous Muskogee, rather than involve themselves in a complicated war with those two confederated nations, which must have ruined Georgia, in the weak condition it then was. And, notwithstanding they have considerably increased since, both in wealth and number of inhabitants, it is probable the colony is now less capable of bearing with any sort of firmness a sudden shock from these savages than they were at that time. For, though the people were then fewer in numbers, yet their settlements were more compact. By this means, they could easily join in social defense on any alarm, and, as the circumstances of most of them did not tempt them to enervating luxury, so the needful exercises they daily pursued enabled them to make a diversion of ranging the woods when occasion required. Plantations are now settled, often at a great distance from each other, even to the outmost boundaries of the colony, where commonly the best gunsmen reside, but who probably would be cut off by surprise at the first onset, and, lower down, the dispersed settlements are often separated either by difficult or unpassable morasses, slow-running black waters, or broken saltwater sounds, which of course would be a great impediment to the people supporting each other, so that each plantation is exposed to a separate assault by a superior body of those cunning savages who attack and fly away like a sudden thunder gust. We have no sure way to fight them, but in carrying the war into the bowels of their own country by a superior body of the provincial troops mixed with regulars, and as we can expect no mercy in case of a defeat, we should not despise their power, but prepare ourselves for a sure conquest.
Leave a comment, for the Bang looks forward to reading them and replying to them. Also, don't forget to like and share this content with like-minded individuals such as yourself. There is plenty more where this came from. Until next time, this Bang content will end in 3, 2, 1.